My name is Alex, and I was a freshman at Penn State University when I first met my roommate Marcus. From the moment I walked into our shared dorm room in East Halls, I knew something was off about this guy. While I was busy unpacking my boxes and trying to make the cramped space feel like home, Marcus sat on his bed completely motionless, staring at his hands. I tried to break the ice. "Hey, I'm Alex. Looks like we're going to be living together this year." Marcus slowly looked up at me with these pale, watery eyes that seemed to look right through me. He mumbled something that sounded like his name, then immediately went back to staring at his hands. The silence that followed was so uncomfortable that I actually considered calling my parents to pick me up right then and there. Over the first few days, I tried everything to connect with Marcus. I'd ask about his major, his hometown, whether he wanted to grab dinner at the dining hall. Every attempt at conversation was met with either complete silence or single-word responses delivered in this monotone voice that gave me chills. He never left the room except to use the bathroom, and I never saw him eat anything. Most disturbing of all, he never seemed to sleep. I'd lie in bed at night, trying to drift off, but I could feel his eyes on me. When I'd roll over to check, sure enough, Marcus would be sitting upright in his bed, staring directly at me in the darkness. The first time it happened, I sat up and whispered, "Marcus, what are you doing?" He immediately laid down and pretended to be asleep, but I could tell he was still watching me. After a particularly sleepless night, I decided to spend more time out of the room. I made friends with some guys down the hall, Jake and Tyler, and started hanging out in their room most evenings. They thought I was crazy when I told them about Marcus, but they hadn't lived with him. They hadn't felt those eyes boring into them every night. One evening, I returned to my room around 11 p.m. to find Marcus sitting at my desk, going through my laptop. My blood ran cold. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded. Marcus slowly turned to face me, and for the first time since I'd met him, he smiled. It was the most unsettling thing I'd ever seen. This wide, unnatural grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Just checking," he said in that same monotone voice. "Making sure you're not saying bad things about me." I realized then that he'd been reading my messages, my emails, everything. I'd been texting my friends and family about how weird my roommate was, and he'd seen it all. I immediately went to the resident advisor and requested a room change. Thankfully, there was an opening in another dorm across campus, and I moved out the next day. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. The first night in my new room, I was woken up around 3 a.m. by a soft tapping on my door. When I looked through the peephole, nobody was there. This happened 3 more times over the next week, always the same gentle tapping, always in the middle of the night, always with nobody there when I checked. Then one night, the tapping was accompanied by a voice, Marcus's voice, whispering my name through the door. "Alex, Alex, I know you're in there, Alex." I was terrified, but I called campus security immediately. When they arrived and searched the area, they found Marcus hiding in a utility closet at the end of the hall. He had apparently been living there for days, surviving on vending machine food and waiting for opportunities to harass me. The security officers found a notebook in his possession filled with detailed observations about my daily routine. He had recorded what time I left for class, when I returned, what I wore, who I talked to, everything. Some entries were accompanied by crude drawings of me sleeping or studying, always with his own face watching from the corner of the page. Marcus was immediately suspended from the university and banned from campus. The administration assured me that he would not be allowed to return, and they increased security patrols around my dorm for the rest of the semester. I never saw Marcus again, but I heard from Jake that he had transferred to a different school out of state. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with the unsettling feeling that someone is watching me. I'll check the locks on my doors and windows, scan the darkness outside, but there's never anyone there. The rational part of my mind knows that Marcus is long gone, probably living his strange, solitary life somewhere far away. But there's another part of me that wonders if he's still out there somewhere, still watching, still waiting. The worst part about the whole experience wasn't the fear or the violation of privacy. It was the realization of how vulnerable we all are. We go through our daily lives assuming that the people around us are basically normal, basically harmless. We trust our roommates, our classmates, the strangers we pass in the hallway. But sometimes, someone slips through the cracks, someone who sees the world differently, who doesn't follow the same social rules that keep the rest of us safe. I learned to be more cautious after that, to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. I also learned the importance of speaking up when someone makes you uncomfortable, even if you can't quite articulate why. If I had acted sooner, if I had reported Marcus's strange behavior earlier, maybe things wouldn't have escalated the way they did. The memory of those pale, watching eyes still haunts me sometimes, especially in the quiet moments before sleep. I wonder what Marcus is doing now, whether he found another target to fixate on, another person to watch and study and terrorize with his presence. I hope not, but deep down, I suspect that people like Marcus don't just stop being who they are. College was supposed to be about new experiences, personal growth, and independence. In a way, I got all of those things, just not in the way I expected. I learned about the darker aspects of human nature, about the importance of trusting my instincts, and about the reality that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one sleeping just a few feet away. I'm Sarah, and this happened during my junior year at University of Vermont. My friends Emma and Chloe and I had discovered this perfect spot deep in the woods behind campus, a small clearing by a creek where we could hang out without worrying about RAs or campus security. It was our secret place, somewhere we could drink beer, smoke cigarettes, and just be ourselves away from the pressures of college life. The clearing was about a 20-minute hike from the nearest dorm, surrounded by thick Vermont forest that seemed to swallow sound. During the day, it was beautiful sunlight filtering through the canopy, the gentle sound of water flowing over rocks. But at night, it took on a completely different character. The trees seemed to close in around us, and every shadow could be hiding something sinister. We'd been using the spot for about a month when things started getting weird. It began with small things. Our fire would suddenly dim for no reason, or we'd hear branches snapping in the distance. Emma, who was always the practical one, insisted it was just animals. Vermont has plenty of wildlife, she'd remind us, deer, raccoons, maybe even bears. But something about these sounds felt different, more deliberate. The first really scary incident happened on a Friday night in late October. We'd built a nice fire and were sitting around it, sharing stories and passing around a bottle of cheap wine. The conversation had turned to ghost stories, probably not the smartest choice given our isolated location, when we heard footsteps in the woods around us. At first, we thought it might be other students who had discovered our spot. But as we listened more carefully, we realized the footsteps weren't moving like someone walking through the forest. They were circling us, staying just outside the ring of light cast by our fire. Round and round, keeping a perfect distance, never getting closer, never moving away. "Hello," Chloe called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately. We sat in complete silence for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, just as we were starting to relax, a stick came flying out of the darkness and landed right in the middle of our fire, sending sparks flying everywhere. Emma jumped up and grabbed the flashlight we always brought. She swept the beam across the trees, but there was nothing there, just empty forest stretching away into the darkness. "Probably just some drunk frat boys messing with us," she said, but her voice was shaky. We decided to pack up and head back to campus. The walk back was terrifying. Every few steps, we'd hear something moving in the trees alongside us, keeping pace with our group. Branches would snap just outside our flashlight beam, and leaves would rustle even though there was no wind. When we finally made it back to the safety of the dorms, we were all breathing hard and looking over our shoulders. We told ourselves it was just our imagination, that we'd psyched ourselves out with the ghost stories. But when we returned to the clearing the following weekend, things got much worse. This time, we hadn't even finished setting up our chairs when the harassment began. Pebbles started raining down on us from the trees above, small stones that stung when they hit but weren't quite large enough to cause real damage. Then came the sounds, not just footsteps now, but what sounded like voices whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. The whispering was the worst part. We couldn't make out actual words, but the tone was unmistakably malicious. It sounded like multiple people talking at once, their voices overlapping in a way that made my skin crawl. Emma was still insisting it had to be people, probably upperclassmen trying to scare us away from their spot. But I was starting to doubt that explanation. Things escalated quickly after that. A large branch came crashing down just inches from where Chloe was sitting. Then our fire was suddenly doused by what seemed like a bucket of water, even though we couldn't see anyone throwing it. In the darkness that followed, we heard something large moving through the underbrush, circling our campsite. We packed up our stuff as quickly as we could, but in our panic, Emma dropped her keys somewhere in the clearing. We couldn't leave without them. They were her car keys, and we needed her car to get back to campus. So we had to search through the dark clearing with our phones' flashlights, all while listening to whatever was in the woods moving closer and closer. I was the one who found the keys, partially buried under a pile of leaves that definitely hadn't been there when we arrived. As I reached down to grab them, I heard breathing right behind me. Slow, deliberate breathing that definitely wasn't human. I spun around, but there was nothing there. We ran back to the car and drove to campus in record time. None of us said much during the drive, but I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. Whatever was in those woods, it wasn't human. The next day, I did some research at the library. I found old newspaper articles about the area around our clearing dating back to the 1800s. Apparently, there had been several disappearances over the years: hunters, hikers, even a few students from the university. Most were eventually found, but not all of them. And the ones who were found could never explain what had happened to them. One article from the 1970s particularly caught my attention. It described the experience of a graduate student who had been doing research in the forest. He claimed to have been stalked by something for several days. Something that stayed just out of sight but made its presence known through sounds and thrown objects. When he was finally found, he was incoherent and remained in the psychiatric ward for several weeks. I showed the articles to Emma and Chloe, and we made a pact to never go back to that clearing. We found a new spot on the other side of campus. Not as secluded, but definitely safer. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I still think about what we encountered in those woods. I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting students to discover its domain. Part of me wants to believe Emma was right, that it was just people messing with us. But deep down, I know better. There was something ancient and malevolent in those woods, something that didn't want us there. We were lucky to get out when we did, and I'll never make the mistake of venturing that deep into the forest again. My name is Kevin, and I was a freshman at Arizona State University when this happened. My roommate Brad was obsessed with joining a fraternity and had convinced me to go with him to some rush events. I wasn't really interested in Greek life, but I figured it would be a good way to meet people and maybe have some fun. The first couple of parties we went to were at well-known fraternities with nice houses near campus. They were crowded and loud, but they felt safe. Lots of people, good music, decent beer. But Brad was convinced he needed a backup plan in case the top-tier fraternities didn't offer him a bid. So when he heard about a party at some underground fraternity across town, he insisted we check it out. The house was in a sketchy part of Phoenix, about 30 minutes from campus. As we pulled up to the address, I immediately felt uneasy. The place looked more like a crack house than a fraternity. Peeling paint, broken windows covered with cardboard, a front yard full of dead grass and empty beer bottles. If it weren't for the loud music and the handful of cars parked outside, I would have assumed the place was abandoned. Brad was undeterred. "It's probably just their party house," he said as we walked up to the front door. A lot of fraternities have separate houses for parties. I wasn't convinced, but I followed him anyway. The guy who answered the door was exactly what I expected. Overweight, sweaty, clearly drunk despite it being only 9 p.m. His name was Tony, and he seemed way too excited to see us. "Fresh meat," he announced to the room as we walked in. "Come on in, guys. The party's just getting started." The interior of the house was even worse than the outside. The living room was packed with maybe 40 guys, all of them giving off serious creep vibes. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of cheap beer and body odor. I counted exactly 3 women in the entire place, and they all looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The lighting was terrible, just a few dim lamps casting long shadows across the room. Most of the guys were clustered around a folding table playing beer pong, but their game looked more like an excuse to splash beer on each other than actual competition. Everyone was talking too loudly, laughing too hard, and standing too close to each other. I gave it an honest try for about 30 minutes, making small talk with various fraternity members. But every conversation felt forced and uncomfortable. These weren't normal college guys. They were all socially awkward in ways that made my skin crawl. One guy spent 10 minutes telling me about his collection of vintage pornography. Another kept asking personal questions about my family's financial situation. Brad seemed to be having a better time than I was, but even he was starting to look uncomfortable. We were getting ready to leave when this huge guy named Rick approached me with a small bottle of what looked like liquor. "Try this," he said, pressing the bottle into my hand. "It's my special recipe. Guaranteed to get you wasted." Something about the way he said it made me nervous, but he was standing way too close and watching me expectantly. I felt like I had no choice but to drink it. The liquid burned going down and it tasted wrong. Not like any alcohol I'd ever had before. Rick kept grinning at me and asking how I felt, which only made me more uncomfortable. Within minutes, I started feeling dizzy and nauseous. The room began to spin, and the voices around me became muffled and distant. The last thing I remember clearly was Rick putting his hand on my shoulder and saying something about showing me upstairs. Then everything went black. I woke up in a bedroom I didn't recognize, lying on top of a mattress that reeked of stale sweat and beer. The room was dark except for a small amount of light coming from under the door. I could hear music and voices from downstairs, but they seemed far away. My head was pounding, and I felt sick to my stomach. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized I wasn't alone. I could hear movement coming from what looked like a closet in the corner of the room. Rustling sounds, like someone going through clothes or papers. My heart started racing as I tried to figure out what was happening. I managed to sit up, fighting waves of nausea, and listened more carefully to the sounds from the closet. It definitely sounded like someone was in there, moving around deliberately and trying to be quiet. I couldn't tell if they knew I was awake, but I knew I needed to get out of there immediately. Moving as quietly as I could, I rolled off the mattress and crawled toward the door. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the sounds from the closet stopped abruptly. I held my breath, waiting to see if whoever was in there would come out, but after a few seconds, the rustling resumed. I made it to the door and slowly turned the handle. The hallway outside was dimly lit by a single bulb, and I could see stairs leading down to the party. I stumbled down the steps, still feeling the effects of whatever Rick had given me, and found Brad near the front door talking to Tony. "We need to leave," I whispered to Brad, grabbing his arm. "Right now." Something in my voice must have convinced him, because he didn't argue. We pushed through the crowd and made it outside to his car. During the drive back to campus, I told Brad what had happened. He was horrified and wanted to call the police, but I was too embarrassed and confused to make a report. I wasn't even sure what crime had been committed, if any. Maybe the guy in the closet was just another party guest who had passed out up there. Maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something terrible had almost happened to me. The way Rick had watched me drink that bottle, the way he'd offered to take me upstairs, the fact that I'd woken up in a strange bedroom with someone hiding in the closet. It all added up to a situation I was lucky to escape from. I never went back to another fraternity party after that, and I made sure to warn other freshmen about that particular house. A few months later, I heard through the campus grapevine that the place had been shut down by the police for drug dealing. Part of me wondered if they'd found evidence of other crimes as well, but I never followed up on it. The experience taught me to be much more careful about accepting drinks from strangers and to always trust my instincts when a situation feels wrong. College is supposed to be about new experiences and pushing boundaries, but there's a difference between taking reasonable risks and putting yourself in genuine danger. I'm Jessica, and this happened during my sophomore year at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I had managed to score a single room in one of the older dorms, Bradley Hall, which was perfect for my studying habits. The room was tucked away at the end of a hallway, around a corner from the main corridor, giving me the privacy I needed to focus on my pre-med coursework. The isolation was exactly what I wanted during the day. I could study for hours without interruption, had friends over when I felt social, and retreat to my quiet corner when I needed space. But at night, that same isolation became something altogether more sinister. Started about 3 weeks into the semester. I was up late studying for an organic chemistry exam when I heard a very soft tapping on my door. It was so quiet I almost didn't notice it at first, just a gentle tap 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 that could have been someone knocking very politely. I assumed it was my friend Rachel from down the hall, maybe coming to borrow notes or chat about some drama. "Come in," I called out, not looking up from my textbook, but the door didn't open. The tapping continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. When I finally got up to check, the hallway was empty. I walked around the corner to the main corridor, but it was deserted too. Everyone else was probably asleep or at the library studying. I shrugged it off and went back to my books. College students are weird. Maybe someone had been knocking on the wrong door and left when they realized their mistake. It didn't seem worth worrying about. But the next night it happened again. This time I was getting ready for bed, brushing my teeth in the tiny sink in my room, when the tapping started. It was slightly louder than the previous night, more insistent. Tap tap tap, pause, tap tap tap. I called out, "Who is it?" but got no response. When I opened the door, once again, nobody was there. This pattern continued for almost a week. Every night, usually between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., someone would tap on my door. Sometimes it was barely audible, other times it was loud enough to wake me from sleep. But whenever I checked, the hallway was always empty. I started asking around to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. My friend Rachel thought it was probably just someone playing a prank. "Maybe it's that weird guy from the 3rd floor," she suggested. "Didn't he ask you out and you turned him down?" But I had turned down several guys since the semester started, and none of them seemed like the type to engage in this kind of harassment. The tapping was starting to affect my sleep and my ability to concentrate. I found myself staying up later and later, dreading the moment when I'd hear those soft knocks on my door. I started leaving my door open when I studied, thinking that might discourage whoever was doing this, but it didn't help. After about 2 weeks of this nightly harassment, I decided to take action. I borrowed a camera from the media center and set it up in my room, pointing it at the door through the peephole. I figured if I could catch this person in the act, I could report them to the RA and put an end to the whole thing. The first few nights with the camera yielded nothing useful. The hallway was too dark to make out details, and whoever was knocking was apparently staying just outside the camera's range. But on the 4th night, I got lucky. I was awakened around midnight by the familiar tapping, but this time it was more aggressive than before. Instead of the gentle knocking I'd gotten used to, this sounded like someone was trying to get my attention urgently. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera feed. There, clear as day, was the back of someone's head as they knocked on my door. I couldn't see their face, but I could tell it was a man with dark hair, wearing what looked like a maintenance uniform. As I watched, he stepped back from the door and looked directly up at the camera. Even in the grainy footage, I could see he was smiling. Not a friendly smile, but something cold and predatory. Instead of confronting him directly, I decided to call campus security. While I was on the phone with the dispatcher, I kept watching the camera feed. The man was still there, but now he was trying the door handle. When it didn't open, I always kept it locked. He pulled something out of his pocket. It looked like he was trying to pick the lock. I was terrified. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept in my closet and positioned myself by the door, ready to defend myself if he managed to get in. The security dispatcher stayed on the line with me, and I could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. When the security officers arrived, they found the man had disappeared. But they took my camera footage seriously and launched an investigation. It turned out that the man was a former maintenance worker who had been fired from the university 3 months earlier for inappropriate behavior toward female students. He had apparently been using his knowledge of the building's layout to harass students in isolated rooms like mine. The officers told me he had been living in the building's basement, using service tunnels to move around undetected. He knew which rooms were occupied by single women and had been targeting several of us. I wasn't his only victim. 3 other girls in different dorms had reported similar experiences. They caught him 2 days later trying to break into another student's room. When they searched his makeshift living space in the basement, they found detailed notes about the daily routines of at least a dozen female students, including me. He had been watching us, learning our schedules, and planning his harassment campaigns. The whole experience was deeply disturbing, not just because of what had happened, but because of what could have happened. If he had managed to get into my room one of those nights, if I had opened the door thinking it was a friend, if I hadn't had the camera to catch him in the act, I don't want to think about how differently things might have turned out. The university increased security in all the dorms and changed their policies about background checks for maintenance workers. They also installed better lighting in the hallways and added security cameras to areas that had previously been blind spots. I moved to a different room on a busier hallway for the rest of the semester, and I never again took my safety for granted. The experience taught me that the most dangerous threats often come from people who have legitimate access to our spaces, people we trust to be there, people whose presence doesn't immediately alarm us. Even now, several years later, I still check my locks multiple times before going to bed, and I never ignore unusual sounds in the hallway. That man may be in prison now, but the fear he instilled in me has never completely gone away. Sometimes the most terrifying experiences are the ones that remind us how vulnerable we really are, how thin the line is between safety and danger in the places we call home.